appreciate you being here as well as your teachings. Next, I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Derek Nault. Derek Nault has a PhD from Queen's University, has taught history and global studies at universities in Canada and East Asia. Most recently, he served as an associate professor at the University of Tokyo in Japan. His research and teaching interests include world history, especially in relation to peoples and nations of the global South, Indigenous studies, and human rights. He's a member of the Global Studies Advisory Board of Common Ground Research Networks and editorial board of the International Journal of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. Originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, he's a citizen of the Red River Métis Nation. His talk today, Our Rightful Place, the Red River Métis Self-Government Treaty as an Example of Indigenous Resilience, speaks about he will detail the historic journey of the Red River Métis fight for self-recognition, culminating in the landmark Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty of 2023. He will examine the decade-long struggle leading up to the unanimous ratification of the treaty, its significance as a redress of past injustices, and how it shapes the Red River Métis people's future. This exploration will highlight the resilience of the Métis, the pivotal role of assemblies in our decision-making, and the aspirations we hold for our youth and the generation to come. It's my privilege to introduce Professor Nault.
Thank you very much, Nada. And this is the title of my talk, as Nada said. It's about Métis self-government treaty that was just ratified by the Annual General Assembly in Winnipeg this month, actually. And I went to one of the sessions where the consultations with the out-of-province Métis in Toronto. So here's the outline of my talk. Obviously, I can't go into great detail in 15 minutes, so I'll try to breeze through the highlights here and try to focus as much as possible on the 2023 treaty and what it means. Right, so where does the Métis Nation come from? Often people just think of Métis as meaning mixed race. So some people think that as long as there's someone who has First Nations ancestry and it's mixed with European ancestry, they are automatically Métis, but that's not true. When I'm talking about Métis here, I'll be talking about the Red River Métis specifically, and they are a people and a nation. So to be part of that nation, you have to submit documents and explain who you are, show your ancestry, and it has to be accepted by the community. And you are, it's confirmed that you are a member through your genealogy and history of your family. The Métis originated in the 18th and 19th century through the fur trade and contacts between Europeans and First Nations peoples. And they had established their own kind of government with the buffalo hunt. It was a very ad hoc kind of government, meaning that whenever they needed to have a leader, they didn't have like a formal kind of structure of governance. They would just kind of say, okay, we need someone to lead us, let's vote for them. And that would take place, say, with the buffalo hunts that they went on, which my great-great-grandparents and great-great-grandfathers, well, parents actually, both, not my parents, great-great-great-grandparents and so on, because men and women did participate in different ways. But there were laws that governed those hunts, and that is where Métis forms of governance originate. And the first time the Métis flag was unfurled was in around 1816 by Cuthbert Grant, who's thought of as the first Métis leader, and during the at Seven Oaks in a conflict with Hudson's Bay employees. The Métis fought a battle and won, and that's called the Victory of the Frog Plain. The other side, the Hudson's Bay Company called it the Seven Oaks Massacre, but we don't know it as a massacre. It was a conflict which the Métis emerged victorious. So we call it the Victory of the Frog Plain, and that's where the La Nouvelle Nation, the new nation of the Métis, really emerged. It was a turning point. Other turning points were the Pierre Guillaume Sayer trial. Was when the Hudson's Bay Company again tried to regulate how the Métis people were trading in the Red River settlement area, which is now Manitoba, and the Métis did not like the HBC trying to tell Métis what to do, so they demonstrated, and eventually that was also a turning point, and the trade became free, and Hudson's Bay couldn't control the Métis. Another example of Métis independence and self-governance was the Battle of Grand Coteau, which was with the Sioux peoples of the Dakotas. And again, the Métis were under attack and emerged victorious. And so these are some of the events. I can't go into all the details, but this is where the idea of nationhood comes from. It's not just a biological fact where someone is mixed race and then they're part of a nation by default. So the Red River Métis have a specific history, and there are specific families who belong to the Red River Métis Nation. So the Métis were very independent, and they were known as the people who own themselves by other Indigenous peoples. That was how it translates into English. And there were key events, again, that where the Métis asserted their independence, such as Richard mentioned the Red River Resistance, which led to the creation of Manitoba. Actually, that began on my great-great-grandfather's land. It's well known that it started there. And the Métis were promised actually 1.4 million acres of land, and which they never received. So the Canadian government, never properly gave them a contiguous land base, meaning land all in one area, which they could call a homeland. So that it was determined that over time, that the Canadian government did not uphold the honor of the Crown, as the Supreme Court of Canada determined I think it was on 2013. So we never received 1.4 million acres. That's still up for negotiation. But that was a time where Métis asserted themselves and were promised that their rights would be protected, and they were not. Many families moved west to what is today Saskatchewan and other places. Many of my family moved out in that direction to Saskatchewan. I'm actually going next month to go to Batoche, where the Northwest Resistance took place, and many of my family participated and were killed there or wounded and exiled. And I'm going to be visiting Batoche. There's an annual get-together back to Batoche, it's called, in July. But by the 1920s, the Métis had been defeated by the Canadian government. Two conflicts took place under John A. Macdonald. Red River Resistance, where they were brought into Confederation very violently. There's something called the Terror, the Reign of Terror, where Métis were assaulted by Canadian troops after Manitoba joined Confederation. And then in 1885, they were defeated again by the Canadian government. And you can see this depiction on the right, the Battle of Batoche. My great-great-grandfather, his name was Damas Carrier, was killed on the very last day of the Battle of Batoche. And that was the very last battle of the Northwest Resistance. And he was cruelly dragged behind a horse to his death. So it was a really brutal, violent death that took place. And, many families had experiences like that, Métis families. And Cardinal says that by the 1920s, we had illiteracy, landlessness, disease to consider in a new world where we had no place. We were obsolete. And then the Red River Resistance and Batoche Resistance were forgotten by the new settlers. They didn't care, and this history was forgotten. So the Métis became known as the forgotten people because they were not recognized by the federal government and became a provincial responsibility, and the provincial governments also did not treat them well or honor their promises that, especially Manitoba, were the center of the Métis Nation. Really, the Manitoban government, rescinded all these protections for the Métis, like for education, and just they were outnumbered and displaced in the years after Confederation. But a lot of the depictions of the Métis stop there, or of Indigenous peoples, and we often have a very dark view of the past. And there's a lot of dark things that have happened in Canadian history and the history of Indigenous peoples. But we're talking about resilience as well as resistance today, and so we have to focus on as well that there have been positive developments in recent years. And it was in the 1960s that the Métis began to rise again as a nation, though the Métis Nation was on the verge of almost disappearing. There was very little in terms of political organization. But in the 60s, Indigenous organizations, and including Métis ones, proliferated, and inspired by the Red Power movement taking place in the 60s, Black Power movement, and the struggle for racial equality and civil rights in the 1960s. And a real turning point, thanks to this man on the right. His name is, he passed away a few years ago, in 2004, Harry Daniels. Thanks to him, in 1982, the Métis people were recognized as an Indigenous people with the Constitution Act, specifically in Section 35. So the Métis before that were not recognized federally, and so that was a major turning point, and for the rebirth of the Métis Nation and resurgence as a people. And another turning point was in 2013, where the Supreme Court of Canada, as I mentioned, they acknowledged the injustices inflicted on the Métis, and they said that Canada had not upheld the honor of the Crown, and did as they promised with the Manitoba Act. So, sorry, I have a timer here. I want to make sure I'm on time. Okay, and so also at that time, the Canada acknowledged the Manitoba Métis Federation as, granted them official standing as a representative body for the government of the Red River Métis. And so the last 10 years or so have been really positive in terms of the progress the Métis people have made. And pivotal in all this has been these annual General Assemblies of the Manitoba Métis Federation. There's our President David Chartrand on the right there. And one turning point was that the General Assembly voted to not recognize the artificial boundaries that divide Métis communities and citizens in our traditional territory. So we have provincial boundaries, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and we have provincial organizations like the Manitoba Métis Federation, but we are more and more looking at Métis, as we're people across who spill over across into many provinces, and we want to have one government to represent all the Métis wherever they may reside. So I live in Ontario, but I can be a citizen still in good standing, through the MMF. That's where I have my citizenship from, and they are, in our view, are the government of the Red River Métis. And the MMF signed a self-government recognition and implementation agreement in 2021 with Canada as well. So this is kind of an agreement on the future, like the direction that relations between the two governments would take, between the Canadian government and then the MMF, which is the Red River Métis government. And finally, this year in 2023, there are all kinds of meetings held with members in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, all over Canada, even in the United States. And I attended one in Toronto where we were able to give our input on this the implementation treaty, and it's the only modern day treaty between the Red River Métis and Canada. So the only other one was 1870, the Manitoba Act, which the Métis negotiated, and were not given the things that were promised. So on June 3rd, I was not able to attend it. I was only able to attend virtually, unfortunately. But in Winnipeg, they had a General Assembly again. 4,000 citizens attended, and they voted unanimously to pass this treaty, so they ratified it. So now there's still one more step. The next step will be to ratify it in Parliament and enshrine it in the Canadian Constitution this fall. So we're looking forward to that happening in the fall. If all goes well, this will be passed by the Canadian government. So the Manitoba Red River Métis through the MMF have ratified it, but now it's up to the Canadian government. So what does this mean? It's the first modern day Métis self-government treaty, and it's a foundation for reconciliation between the Red River Métis and Canada. So until this treaty, really the events of the 1800s, the two resistances and what happened after, there was not really true reconciliation. As I mentioned, the Métis were basically forgotten, ignored by the federal government. So this is really important step toward true reconciliation. And the MMF, again, is given more powers as the national government of the Red River Métis under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. And why it's important is that because when provincial governments or federal governments change, quite often they have a different stance toward Indigenous peoples, and with Métis people, it's no different. So, quite often, one government is supportive, then another one, totally ignores the Métis or cuts funding and so on. So this will ensure that the Métis cannot be ignored. All future governments, provincial and federal, will have to deal with, the Métis. Red River Métis government and Red River Métis people. So, and any future agreements will take place as a result of this treaty. So it's a really, really important step in our history. So I was really excited to be a part of this process. I regrettably couldn't go to Winnipeg to vote, but I could do so, virtually from here in Ontario. So David Chartrand says, with this vote, our treaty rights are wrong that took place 153 years ago when our first treaty, the Manitoba Act, was negotiated and then ignored by Canada. We negotiated this agreement in good faith with Canada, but before negotiations were even complete, Canada backstabbed our nation. Today, we are another step closer to justice, taking yet another step in restoring our rightful place in Canada's Confederation through this treaty may well be the most important thing we've done as a nation to date. So he said that this very month, David Chartrand, our president of the Red River Métis Nation. And on the right, you can see where the actual homeland is. So that's the traditional homeland. And so as you can see, the Métis roamed and lived in all those areas traditionally. And many of us live outside, but we still can belong to the Red River Métis Nation. And the role of the government, the body of the MMF will eventually be just, it won't be that kind of organization. It'll just be our government, and we'll be more assured and clear in the future, and we'll have more input and more say in how the future direction of the Métis Nation. So it's a really big step and really exciting time. So I thought this story is important to tell for when we talk about the idea of resilience. And, like Richard said, we're still around, the Métis people are still around, and now we will be certain to be around in the coming years as well, thanks to this treaty and the future agreements that will be negotiated based on the treaty. And those are my references. So thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Derek. To all our students, welcome. Those of you just joining